This is Christina Ha, and you're watching The Unblinking Eye. Jazz music is not native to New York, but the city's influence helped it thrive. So how did the metropolis shape the music, and how did the music affect the region? A recent Gotham Center for New York City History forum held at the CUNY Graduate Center in Midtown Manhattan examined these questions. Panelists featured in the popular Ken Burns jazz documentary reviewed the issues and reminisced about this great musical era.
All of these gentlemen are affiliated with the film that was aired on PBS on History of Jazz, of course. But in fact, it is not the film per se that is the subject of our evening. The subject is the history of jazz in New York City. How, in fact, was the music shaped by New York? How did the music shape the city in turn? That interplay of questions. Obviously, there is an enormous amount of data and information that we can draw upon from the film, but it's not an investigation of the techniques of presentation and cinematography as it is about the subject of the relation between jazz and Gotham. So, our speakers, and again, I could easily take the entire evening just simply listing the credentials of this group, but so let me just very quickly say that Geoff Ward, who does many other things aside from jazz, has written 12 books, including the award-winning First Class Temperament. He has done a whole series of films for public television, 4 of them Emmy winners, most famously, of course, the series on the Civil War and on baseball, and on this series, Jazz, for which he was the writer, which is in fact the one that has meant the most to him. The second person to speak will be, and Gary and Dan Morgenstern are going to start off by, between the two of them, sketching out some of the overview about this question of how did jazz come to New York, how did it evolve during the years since its arrival. So the second person will be Dan Morgenstern, who has been writing about jazz for 45 years now. He is the director of the Institute for Jazz Studies at Rutgers. He has been the editor of various jazz magazines, Downbeat just among them, and he has been a prolific annotator of jazz albums, 6 of which have won Grammy Awards. Then we will go to Albert Murray, who has also written 12 books. This is an extremely prolific group, including The Omni-Americans, South to a Very Old Place, Trading Dozens, his recent collection of letters back and forth with Ralph Ellison, and perhaps the one that's most pertinent to what he'll talk about this evening, is Good Morning Blues, the autobiography of Count Basie, as told to Albert Murray. Gary Giddins has been at the Village Voice since 1973, born in Brooklyn, New Yorker. He has done biographies, superb ones of Charlie Parker and Louis Armstrong. His Visions of Jazz won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. And his most recent book, on the stands now, is a biography of Bing Crosby called Pocketful of Dreams. And then conclude with Robin Kelley, a professor at NYU who has written extensively on African American studies in general and jazz in particular. He's written, among, again, many books, Yo Mama's Dysfunctional, and perhaps the most important title in his repertoire is one which is not yet finished but will be out later, called Mysterioso, in Search of Thelonious Monk. So, with that, let me turn the floor over to Geoff Ward, and we're off and running. Thank you.
It's nice to be here. Mike Wallace asked me to set the table for tonight's conversation. All I have to do, he said, is tell the story of the city's role as an incubator of jazz in 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Lots of luck. This will be the sketchiest and most simplistic of outlines. New York likes to see itself as the source of all things new and creative, but jazz itself, by which I mean, for the sake of this discussion, or this part of this discussion, the all-American amalgam of musics created by black and Creole musicians in New Orleans around the turn of the 20th century, was a relative latecomer to New York. It had begun to flourish in several towns, most notably Chicago, long before the original Dixieland Jazz Band opened at Reisenweber's restaurant on Columbus Circle on January 17, 1917. New York had its own rich popular musical traditions, of course. Ragtime was still America's most popular music, and New Yorkers had created their own distinctive brand, Eastern Ragtime, or Harlem Stride. It was orchestral piano, Willie the Lion Smith once explained. The other boys from the South and West, they played in smaller dimensions. We wouldn't dare do that because our public was used to better playing. That seems to me is a quintessentially New York remark about everything. The first blossoming of Black Broadway had ended around 1910, but gifted composers like Will Votery and Will Marion Cook were still at work, still seeking to make something new and fresh out of black vernacular music. And the remarkable band leader James Reese Europe was determined to find new ways to reveal to the world what he called the musical proficiency of the African race. But if jazz was relatively slow to reach the city, it was the fledgling recording industry centered here that turned it into a national craze. Within months of the original Dixieland Jazz Band's first record, jazz, or that band's rowdy version of it, was being heard in a host of New York clubs and theaters and hotel ballrooms, played by the Louisiana Five, the Georgia Five, Alabama Five, St. Louis Five, Domino Five, original Indiana Five, the Frisco Jazz Band, and a quintet called the Original New Orleans Jazz Band, which featured 4 authentic New Orleans musicians, but was actually the creation of a Brooklyn-born ragtime piano player named Jimmy Durante. In some of these bands in those days, the cornet player played the melody, Durante remembered. In some others, the clarinet played the melody. In our band, nobody played the melody. For most of these groups, melody and music were less important than noise and novelty. The message they seemed to want to convey, one writer remembered, was, let's all get loaded and see how nutty we can sound. And after 1920, there were plenty of places in New York to get loaded. According to the police commissioner, there were more than 32,000 speakeasies in the city. Can that possibly be true?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Prohibition was a disaster for law enforcement and a godsend for jazz. That same year, New York also became the headquarters of what the saxophonist Johnny Hodges remembered as blues fever, the explosive growth of race records made by Bessie Smith, Mamie Smith, and their rivals, aimed at black record buyers, but bought as well by at least some whites hip enough to want them. There are countless turning points in the history of any art, but surely the New York autumn of 1924 was more important than most in the history of jazz. During the first 2 weeks of October of that year, a prescient jazz enthusiast visiting the West Side could, within one evening and without walking more than 4 blocks, have seen and heard 3 of the music's best remembered figures at the dawn of their careers, could have witnessed the first stirrings of the transformation that would turn what had mostly been a novelty into an art. Duke Ellington and his Washingtonians were enjoying their second season at the Hollywood Club, a cellar spot on 49th Street at Broadway. It was an unprepossessing place. The drummer, Sonny Greer, remembered that he had standing orders to step up the volume of his playing whenever the rats that sometimes scuttled among the tables began to squeak. The band still had just 6 pieces, and Ellington was mostly arranging other people's tunes rather than writing his own. But he was learning fast from his stride piano heroes, as well as the veteran Broadway composers he cultivated, while the fresh colors and textures he had begun to develop in his arrangements and the startling growls of cornetist Bubba Miley and trombonist Charlie Irvis were already drawing so much attention that the club had begun to advertise itself as the place where the professional musician makes his rendezvous. Just a block down Broadway at 48th Street, Bix Beiderbecke and the Wolverines were making their New York debut at the Cinderella Ballroom. Word of their consistently hot music had preceded them. It was then still rare for any white band to play jazz seriously. And on opening night in September, at least 50 musicians had climbed the stairs to the second floor ballroom, eager to hear the Wolverines in person. Armstrong's arrival in New York on September 30th had not been particularly auspicious. He was no country boy. Born and brought up in the tough streets of New Orleans, he had visited big towns up and down the Mississippi and had spent 2 years on the south side of Chicago as well, playing alongside his mentor, Joe Oliver. His section mate, Howard Scott, remembered his debut at Roseland. He was scared at first. He said, "How am I doing, Scotty?" I said, "Listen, just close your eyes and play what you feel. Be yourself. Forget about all the people." So he did. People stopped dancing to come around and listen to him. And we were told that there were some people passing by in the street that stopped. He was so loud, the next night you couldn't get into the place. He sounds like poetry in a sea of doggerel, as Dan Morgenstern once wrote. Whenever they could get away from the Hollywood Club, Duke Ellington and his men came to Roseland to hear Armstrong too. There weren't the words coined for describing that kick, Ellington remembered. Everybody on the street was talking about the guy. And like Coleman Hawkins and a host of other musicians, Ellington himself would soon be searching for ways to incorporate Armstrong's ideas into his own music. No one knew what swing was till Lewis came along. The others had the idea of it, but Lewis could do it. He was the heir of all that had gone before and the father of all that was to come.
It was Coleman Hawkins who said that if you haven't made it in New York, you haven't made it. And jazz is no different from any other art. You have to come to New York if you want to really be somebody. Jascha Heifetz wasn't Jascha Heifetz until he played Carnegie Hall. And, you know, you could mention almost anybody in any art at all, and you would conclude that if they didn't make it here, they didn't make it. The history of jazz is littered with names of supposedly great musicians who never came to New York, supposedly great bands that never came to New York, and consequently are relegated to footnote status. Why is that so? Well, for one thing, New York is the place where there is an audience for almost everything, and where you can break through with innovation, which you can't do in other parts of the world or this country. The other is that New York is what we now call the media center, more or less, of the universe. And it is sometimes not sufficiently well recognized that jazz spread throughout the globe in a remarkably short time because of the innovations of the 20th century that made possible recording of music, jazz being a form of music that is not noted for notation, and which communicated itself in a remarkably effective way through the medium of recordings. And the record industry was headquartered in New York. Radio, which was a brand new medium, didn't come into its own until the early 20s. That was also focused in New York. And of course, so was the press, both daily and weekly. Geoff has told us about the 20s, and of course that was a significant formative period. Duke Ellington, who started out in New York, actually in the Broadway area, at Times Square, didn't really make it big until he came to the Cotton Club in 1927. And one of the reasons why that engagement was so pivotal in Ellington's career was that the Cotton Club had a national radio wire. He was heard all over the United States. It was in New York, too, that new forms of presenting the music originated. The public jam session, which we generally, if we are of a certain age, tend to identify with Norman Granson Jazz at the Philharmonic. Started on a smaller scale in terms of how many people were witnessing a given performance much earlier, and it started in New York. On 52nd Street and in Greenwich Village, at the Village Vanguard, at Nick's in the Village, and at Jimmy Ryan's on 52nd Street, various people got the bright idea of presenting a host of musicians whom you could engage, even though there were big names, big jazz names, for $5 or $10 for an afternoon's work, usually Sunday afternoon and early evening. And you would have these marvelous sessions that brought together musicians from various big bands, musicians who were at the moment not employed, musicians who the textbooks would have us believe were stylistically different, and they all played together. It was in New York, too, that independent jazz labels began their life. Commodore was the first one, but they really blossomed still during World War II, in the wake of the recording ban that was implemented by the American Federation of Musicians in 1942. And after that, the big labels held out and small labels sprang up. It was in New York and the surrounding area, including Newark, where Savoy Records first began. Blue Note, which was started by two immigrants, two refugees from Nazi persecution. New York's the center of music publishing. New York was the center of talent agencies, the agencies that booked people all around the country. So this was, and this is the nexus, and this was where the music really became visible and audible all over the world.
The lore of New York has only strengthened over time. By the 1950s, it's not just that musicians who didn't come to New York became local legends, but they didn't become stars. They didn't become part of the history of the music. And one of the reasons for that is that the musicians themselves, the good ones, eventually accepted the fact that if they wanted to have serious careers, however much they might hate this concept, they were going to have to come to New York. One example I would give, in the late 50s and early 60s, there had been a serious group of tremendously gifted musicians in Boston. And you would occasionally read remarks about some of these musicians in passing. You know, most of you probably know the famous Steinberg drawing of New York, the way New Yorkers see the United States. It basically goes, you know, to the East River, and then the rest of the country is half an inch. There's a tendency in New York to talk about everything else as out-of-town jazz. Some of these Boston musicians eventually came to New York, and suddenly Jackie Byard became a jazz star. Sam Rivers became a jazz star. When I say star, I mean that they began to record, had articles written about them, played clubs, became part of the jazz history in a sense. I'm not suggesting that they were making a living. It's a different kind of stardom. On the other hand, a musician I've been hearing about all my life is Herb Pomeroy, who stayed in Boston and consequently is hardly known by most people in the jazz world. There were many other examples of that. By the 1960s, there had been an avant-garde movement that was peculiarly national in scope, and that most of the musicians were all over the place. But it was only when they began to come to New York. Ornette Coleman came from Texas by way of California to New York. Suddenly he became a national figure. Cecil Taylor came from New Jersey to Boston, back to New York, became an important figure. Pharoah Sanders came from, I think, Arkansas, and on and on. A group of musicians from St. Louis, known as the Black Artist Group, BAG, same thing, moved to New York. These guys have been playing for a long time, and usually jazz musicians, you begin to hear of them when they're early 20s. These guys were in their late 20s, early 30s, some cases even older than that, but they didn't become known until they got here. It's not fair, and I recently did a book tour, and in fact, I wrote a piece about it in The Voice a few weeks ago about the fact that when you do stops, people will always come over to you and hand you a CD. And so I was accumulating a lot of out-of-town jazz. And the hotels these days, the clock radios now often have CDs players. So I started listening to some of them, and some of them were awfully good. I don't think that they would make a tremendous impact here, because most of the music, jazz is a generic music as well as being a creative art. And so there are a lot of people who learn how to play it very well without necessarily adding anything to it. And they sound great if you're out of town. I mean, when you're in Iowa, if you're in Iowa and you hear somebody who can really do West Montgomery, it's like thrilling. But when you get back to New York, there's West Montgomery. And this kind of thing, there are Wayne Shorter players all over the United States, which is a good thing since Wayne Shorter is no longer playing Wayne Shorter. But beyond that, they're not going to contribute. I have to tell one anecdote about this. In the 70s, I guess it was, a radio producer associated, I think, with, I don't know if it was NPR or something like that, some kind of nonprofit radio organization, contacted me, and he had the idea for doing a series of radio hours on different jazz communities around the country. He was convinced that there were all these great players, these Peck Kelleys, these legendary figures that no one's heard of because they didn't come to New York. So he was in Jacksonville, and I went out to Jacksonville, and he kept telling me about this piano player I had to hear. But the first couple of nights, it turned out he had a cold or something, and he couldn't play. So instead, he took me to meet a plastic surgeon who played alto saxophone, and who had a tremendous hospital where a lot of very wealthy people from around the country came to have their parts of their bodies lifted. And but he was accomplished enough alto saxophone that when Duke Ellington was commissioned to write a suite for the Jacksonville Symphony, he assigned the alto part to this player. Now, this is an example of what I was talking about before. This guy could really do Johnny Hodges, with one exception. He couldn't improvise a note, but he could play a Johnny Hodges solo. He could get that kind of sound. It's silly to think that somebody like that, however how lauded he is in his hometown, is going to be able to come to New York and even work. Well, I spent a little time following him around his hospital and interviewed him, and we talked about the Ellington experience. He gave me a tape of the Jacksonville suite, which was an impressive piece of music to hear. And then finally, this piano player that everybody was telling me that I had to hear was in the club, and we went out to hear him, and you couldn't parody what this guy was playing. It was like very bad rhythm and blues piano. He only knew 3 or 4 tunes. Nobody there minded. This convinced me that there was not going to be a radio series, and I flew back to New York. Dan mentioned 52nd Street. Later we'll talk a little bit about the economics of jazz. For a long time, the jazz scene was largely situated in Harlem. There were many, many clubs, a lot of great musicians working up there, a lot of jam sessions, and a lot of places where after hours you could have integrated jam sessions. There were also a lot of clubs midtown. In the 30s, the scene started to gravitate down towards this amazing, legendary 52nd Street, which I'm sure you've all heard about and read about, and we all wish that we could take a time trip back just to see what it must have been like. There are a lot of theories about why 52nd Street rose at the expense of Harlem. And one of them that you encounter a lot during the last 15, 20 years is that the mobsters who own most of the real estate and most of the clubs on 52nd Street first of all, spread the word that Harlem was dangerous, but basically they made it dangerous by pouring thousands of tons of heroin into the black communities starting around 1946. 52nd Street at that point didn't have much longer to go either, but it certainly burned bridges in Harlem as a place where everybody in New York felt comfortable to congregate and hear music. Harlem is now coming back, of course. I want to say a little bit about the ability to hear jazz because this has affected, I think, its role in New York life and in American life. And simply to say that when I was growing up in the 1960s, it was not hard to hear a lot of the great jazz musicians as a kid. You could afford the clubs. There were places that, the Village Gate, for example, had a fairly, I don't know, $4 or $5, I think, to get downstairs and hear a triple bill. But upstairs, it was free. You had to buy a drink. You could sit at the bar, and for one beer, you could hear Jackie Byard and Bill Evans alternate sets all night. Not once did anybody ever say, you know, drink up, buddy, and leave. These were not great years for jazz, and they were happy to have people there. Occasionally, Art DeLugoff, who, you know, at that time didn't know me, he owned the place. You know, I was 16, 17 years old, would say, if you want to take a table to anybody at the bar, please do, because he wanted the guys who were playing to think at least that they had an audience. There were Sunday matinees at the Vanguard where you could go and hear Miles Davis, great players. There were jazz concerts, which now pretty much only exist in the summer festivals and in the programs at Lincoln Center or Carnegie Hall, but which were much more routine then. And there were Jazz Mobile and all kinds of things. The first time I ever, one of my life-changing experiences was when the World's Fair opened up, and I went to see Lionel Hampton, and the opening act, somebody I did not know anything about, was Errol Garner. That was something that changed my life, I think, hearing Errol Garner under those circumstances. Louis Armstrong you could hear in Central Park. Duke Ellington, the first time I saw him was at the Woolman skating rink in Central Park. A lot of these situations simply don't exist. The clubs are difficult to get into financially. Most kids don't have that kind of money to spend. You know, sometimes it's $35 to walk in, the tips. This is an issue that has become very troublesome in New York in the last 15 and 20 years. All of this has changed the whole complexion of the way the music is heard, and I think it's been very detrimental. We can continue that. It's not something that the general public is running around saying, you know, man, did you hear those bass lines? I don't think you're going to hear anything really radical. I think that the best we can hope is that we're going to continue to produce generations of musicians who are at least individual enough in the way that they play the music.
This is Christina Ha, and you're watching The Unblinking Eye. In the last 30 minutes, we've been listening to experts discuss the pivotal role the New York scene has played in the rise of popular jazz music. In the next half hour, the conversation looks at the unique sounds of the city. Let's return to CUNY's Graduate Center in Midtown Manhattan for the conclusion of the forum.
I think everyone agrees that New York is sort of the place to be, but it is a sad story because there are great artists who made a conscious decision. Some great artists we never heard of, like the legendary Hassan, who is was an amazing pianist in Philadelphia who made, I think, one recording with Max Roach, and if you could find it, it's really incredible. I mean, he is a really creative, inventive person who draws from the kind of Herbie Nichols tradition. The other person who I think is really worth talking about and thinking about is a man named Horace Tapscott. Horace Tapscott recently published a posthumous memoir called Songs of the Unsung, and it's so beautiful because he could have come to New York, he could have made it. But he made a decision to stay there to do precisely what we're asking, you know, us in New York to do, and that is educate young people. He set up an institution there. A lot of young people came and studied, and many of the young people who studied actually went into hip-hop music. If you listen to freestyle fellowship groups like that, they studied under Horace Tapscott, who was a great pianist. Anyway, that's my little speech. But let me, with the 5 minutes I have, let me, I decided to talk about the sound of New York. I just came up with this. And what I mean by that is not the sounds that musicians produce, but the sounds that musicians hear and how it shapes their music. I mean, think about someone like Thelonious Monk, who I'm writing about. He always talked about the sounds of the city. He talked about the subway and the sounds it produced. And he talked about, you know, cabs honking and construction sites and, you know, cats screaming or in heat or whatever, screaming, same thing. He lived on West 63rd Street, and so the sounds of the boats along the Hudson were very significant for him. And as most of you know, the song Little Rudy Tooty in some ways reproduces that sound of the boats. Of course, this is not entirely new because so many musicians really drew from the sounds of the train whistle, and it, you know, both in the blues and in jazz. And there are other sounds. Think about the sounds inside of Thelonious Monk's apartment complex at 243 West 63rd Street. In doing the research, I kind of located every single person who lived in that apartment complex, and most of them actually were not US-born black people. It was a mix. Some were Irish, some were Caribbean-born, from the Spanish-speaking and British Caribbean. And so the sounds he must have heard in the hallways coming out of homes, the sounds from the radio, were sounds of a whole variety of different musics from the Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean and the British Caribbean, and as well as the sounds of language, the sounds of speech. Think of the sounds of worship, for example. I mean, so many musicians, Monk included, kind of grew up in the church. As you know, most of you know that Thelonious Monk learned to play organ. He traveled with a Pentecostal preacher who was a healer all across the country for almost 2 years, ended that tour in California. And in the process, he played the music that he called, in his words, rhythm and blues. What he heard was not just the sound of church music, but the sound of shouts, the sound of screams from an audience, from a congregation, from followers who are trying to, who find so much power in the music itself. And that sound, of course, shapes his own sound. Think of the sounds of the human voice. Consider the language and rhythms of black speech, for example, which is so fundamental to the making of jazz, modern or otherwise. The speech that's so dominant that white fans and musicians mimicked it and continue to do so. The rhythm, the improvisational character, the speed, the wit, were, in my view, not just drawn from by musicians themselves, but that speech itself was taken from the music. That in some ways the hipster speech is about trying to reproduce the sound of the music. It's a dialectic that operates. I mean, think about terms like, I capped an underground rattler to the land of Nod. That was like a 1940s term, which of course means what? I got in the subway, an underground rattler. Think about terms like all reet, as opposed to all right, or copaesthetic. Copaesthetic is an invented term, and very much about, again, the improvisational character of language itself. There were voices of the audience, the call and response. The shouts that we hear in the church, we also hear in the clubs. And some of my favorite recordings are recordings where you hear those sounds of voices, and those voices that are pushing musicians forward and drawing so much excitement. One of my favorite recordings actually is outside of New York. It's in California, on Central Avenue. And it's Wardell Gray playing Move, and he has all kinds of people. It's like a jam session. It's, Sonny Chris is on that session, and Dexter Gordon. And so he's playing Move, and the audience is shouting. And they're screaming, and they scream, and he plays, and he's building up so much momentum. And then at one point, he decides to quote his solo from Twisted in this recording, in this live recording, and the audience goes crazy. One, because they recognize it. Two, because it's like when you start to quote, you're speaking back to the audience. You're showing your ability to draw from all kinds of resources and tell a story. And so what I'm suggesting is that we should think about that sound. Think about the sound of politics. Harlem was the central place for the soapbox speakers. It was a place where musicians heard Adam Clayton Powell. They heard Malcolm X. They heard Queen Mother Audley Moore. They heard the black arts poets standing on the corner reading poetry. And many of these figures, again, sounded like hipsters. Why? Because they sounded like what they thought was the reproduction of the sound of the music itself, And moreover, those musicians listened to, absorbed the ideas, the political messages on these street corners, and they found their way into the music. And so all I'm suggesting is, and this is my kind of conclusion, each one of these sounds, these sources of sounds, and their impact on the music can be discussed ad infinitum. We might consider thinking more broadly about a sonic history of New York, which would make a good CD-ROM, I guess. But a sonic history of New York, it may offer a kind of more expansive way to think about the source of musicians' ideas.
Thanks, Robin. I was actually going to ask, in throwing out questions, if there was such a thing as a New York sound. So that might be fun, in fact, for other people to play with. I was also struck with the degree to which there's that same tradition in writers about New York, at the very least since Walt Whitman, who, in fact, made it their point to go out and absorb from the streets, and then, in fact, to give all of that back, the cries, the shouts, the observations, and painters, in fact, have followed in that tradition. There's a Whitmanian stream, which, in fact, would be be a lot of fun to play with in the world of music. Let me just make a comment or two about what I hear coming out of most of the panelists, and then go back to the panelists for amplification and discussion. If we're trying to get a fix on why New York and what makes it central, there are several things, it seems to me, to come out of this discussion. One of them is multiplicity. That is to say, this place is a great vortex of populations. It's a cliche, but in fact it's true. And I think one of the facts about New York City's cultural history in general has been the degree to which there has been a mixing and a clash, and not always a friendly one. In fact, there have been, as much violence and hatred and warfare amongst the various immigrants and nationalities and ethnic groups and races, but there has also been this tradition of connection across those lines. A.B.'s Irish Rose, West Side Story, the Romeo and Juliet kind of tradition. And I think out of that clashing and fusing has repeatedly come some of the most distinctive kinds of New York cultural products. The second thing is the degree to which there is a relationship between the kinds of cultural products, music and writing and painting, that bubble up, as it were, from the streets of New York. Think doo-wop, think hip-hop. We're talking about, again, traditions that are burst on the street. And yet, because this is indeed the media capital, and it has been since the middle of the 19th century, there is an amplification system here which immediately picks these things up and then broadcasts them out to the rest of the world. Finally, the last thing that I heard in all of this is openness to change and possibility. And there's some peculiar ironies here. We touched on this quickly, but something else that it might be fun to play around with is the role of organized crime in fostering this openness. In New York City, we have had guardians of morality. We have a decency panel on the horizon just now. This is, in fact, a very, very old tradition in New York. There's been waves. Anthony Comstock, makes Rudy Giuliani look like a, liberationist. So there have been, in fact, terrific movements of constriction. There have been, however, terrific forces of resistance. Tammany Hall was, in fact, one of them. Organized crime was another. It's intriguing, perhaps, to ask whether the constraints that got imposed on places like New Orleans early on with the closing of Storyville in the First World War, or in Chicago later on with crackdowns, and whether or not New York, in an odd way, preserved a liberated zone within which musicians from out of town could interact with musicians in the Harlem community and elsewhere, under the aegis of the people who were running the Cotton Club and a lot of the Midtown venues. Who was it? Was it Billy Strayhorn who said, God, he really misses the gangsters. In some extent, it'd be nice to go back to that moment. So these are some of the things that I'm hearing, and I would, I guess, like to throw it open to our panelists.
I'll say something about
There we go.
the mob. It's very tempting to romanticize the mob, and it's also ludicrous. Louis Armstrong's life was threatened by them. That alone, they all go to hell. It's true that they gave probably more musicians work than any other, certainly municipality. In fact, I would say that the best thing that the United States government ever did for jazz probably was Prohibition, which created all of those speakeasies and clubs, many of which employed musicians. But these are not patrons of the arts, per se. They are trying to make money. And so if people are coming in to listen to those musicians, they will present them. When the audience wants to hear a rhythm and blues band, the jazz musicians will cease to work there. I remember a club in the late 60s near Lincoln Center. It was called La Boheme. I don't know how long it lasted. But a friend of mine was playing there, and he invited me to come and hear the band. And it was a mob-owned place. And the musicians were terrified. These were like, adults. And they were afraid of speaking in the place that somebody would hear them, no matter what it was. I remember we have to keep walking outside. I remember Booker Ervin was a musician I absolutely adored, and he was playing in this group. And I said to him, how do musicians play overtones and the hidden register, which was a big thing in the 60s. People are always talking about the hidden register, which is a kind of term for squeaking, basically. And he said, you bite the reed, which I thought was hilarious, a very funny remark. And then he looked around like, somebody's going to hear him. And the leader of the band, I was saying, it was Ted Curson, trumpet player, and I was asking about the place, and I mean, everybody was just afraid to talk. Well, it turns out the place closed in just days because, and then it switched to something else which they hoped would be more economically feasible. There was a legendary jazz club for many, many years downtown called the Half Note, and they came uptown, 54th Street, and they had tremendous musicians. They had the Modern Jazz Quartet and Dizzy Gillespie, and I mean major stars week after week. They couldn't, for whatever reason, the people who owned the place kicked the jazz out, and they replaced it with a go-go bar. But the interesting thing to me was that despite the fact that there was now a stripper in the window, they still called it the Half Note, which let you know who owned the place. So, what the mobsters did in hiring musicians on 52nd Street or back in Prohibition, there's a lot to discuss about that, but to suggest that I don't think Billy Strayhorn or anybody else is quite serious when they say, gee, I wish I was working for Frank Costello again.
Gary, listen, in most cases, whatever mob ownership there may have been of clubs, they didn't run it directly. They put somebody else in there, usually somebody who knew a little bit about the music at least. And most of the famous clubs in New York at least were not mob related. Although somebody may think that the Termini brothers had something to do with it, they didn't, nor did the Half Note have anything to do. When the Half Note moved uptown, which was the worst move they could have made. How many of you ever went to the old Half Note? Whoa. See, a goodly number. See, when it moved uptown, it lost its special character, and it became just another overpriced midtown club, and it didn't work at all. But it had nothing to do, the guy who came up with the money had nothing to do with the mob. He was a record distributor from New Haven who loved jazz and meant well and talked the Cantarinas into moving uptown, but it had nothing to do with the mob. In 52nd Street, Joe Hellbuck, who was the first one, the Onyx Club, that had been a speakeasy, and yeah, you had to have connections, but he wasn't a mobster. Jimmy Ryan was a Broadway hoofer who went into, the nightclub business. The Famous Door, which was one of the first jazz clubs, was started by a cooperative of studio musicians.
Let's talk for a second about race. It is interesting. We had this geographic divisions in centers of jazz production in the city. You had Harlem, you had Midtown, and you had the Village. Now, the early story, if I've got this right, is that very largely in the beginning, Midtown is a white space. And that slowly blacks from uptown come down and infiltrate, and there's this transformation. I'm wondering how much of the energy that there was generated both in the music and out in the city at large had to do with the fact that in the 20s and in the 30s and in the 40s still, this was racially coded music, and that there was an energy and a charge that was somehow involved in the play off the transgressions across racial lines. I don't know how important people think that was, and then if in fact it has changed dramatically. Anything to that?
The one thing I've observed is when I go to Lincoln Center for dancing under the stars, and I see all the various people, the kids that grew up in New York and grew up in the United States, and how much better they are idiomatically in terms of the nuances of the idiom of jazz, how much closer they seem to it than their grandparents or some of the grandparents of people who used to hang out at Savoy. came out of Savoy, and they were pretty square compared with these young kids. So I just don't see I don't see a race.
All right, okay.
It depends on what you mean by race. And I only see I do not see behavior in terms of, I see that only in terms of cultural condition or environmental condition. By culture, I mean habitat, environment, physical and ideational. That's all I can get.
Right.
Because otherwise, you got to explain why the dance music is so related to the church music. Well, the answer is Christianity, and people went to church before they went to juke joints. You start going to church at this height, you start going to dances at that height. And you find that you have a secular variation on the same approach to music, and that's not racial.
Robin?
You know, I don't dispute that at all. I completely agree. I think one of the questions is whether or not a lot of the fans of jazz, whether or not a lot of the fans of jazz actually think that way. In other words, are they drawn to the music because they think that somehow it's closer to what they think of as like the authentic black experience? I mean, this is something you wrote about in Omni-Americans. I mean, the fact that many people, you know, are drawn to black culture because they think there's some kind of essence to it.
When you say black culture, you mean, I suppose,
Right, no.
specific variation on American culture.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm not disputing that. That's not the point.
You're
That's
only
not the
talking
point.
about idiomatic variation.
Right. No, the
And
point
they
is
do
whether.
it because it's elegant.
Right.
It's pretty.
Absolutely.
Makes you feel good.
Yeah, exactly. But that's
So,
yeah.
in
No,
effect,
that's absolutely
it's
true.
more functional, and it adds up. They act as if it's better, simply because they enjoy it.
Right. Right.
That's the way it is with all aesthetic experience.
I agree.
But I don't. But you
Yeah.
well, look.
But we're talking about something different, though.
Point that impresses me is that if you went to the West Indies, if you went to Jamaica or something, I mean, you wouldn't hear any blues. If you did, it would be very corny. That's really true. They could do with it what some of the country and western guys do with it. It's because they're not close enough to it. The same thing is true so far as music is concerned, pure music, that is the technology of music. You get Scandinavians who can play the trumpet, play the saxophone, play the piano, and so forth. But when Americans hear it, they miss an idiomatic quality that's native to them, that is a part of their environment.
Is there anybody else who wants to make any other comments, reflections on any of these themes?
I'd like to say one little thing which may be a little riff off what has just been said. I came to this country in 1947 at the age of 17, and I was already, you know, although I knew a lot less, but I was already a jazz fan. And what I wanted to see was 52nd Street, not the Empire State Building, which you could see anyway, you know. But when I began to enter, New York life, so to speak, it was a very moving experience to me. For instance, the first time I ever went to the Apollo Theater in Harlem, it was a kind of interesting in terms of what Albert just said, because, well, it had nothing to do with West Indian, but it had something to do with Cuban. I saw Dizzy Gillespie's big band with Chano Pozo, and it was remarkable. He was something else. I mean, just, you can't imagine what he was like visually, too. But the thing was that the way the audience, and it started going to the Apollo, quite frequently, the way the audience at the Apollo responded to the performers was something entirely different from the way it was downtown, so to speak. So that you know, that was an idiomatic difference. But to say it very quickly in terms of what Mike was getting at, I think, to me, jazz is the one area of American life where, you know, where people got together in a very special way. And I don't know whether that, I hope that hasn't disappeared, but in terms of, you know, Teddy Wilson, who was the first black musician, so to speak, to appear regularly as part of an integrated ensemble. There's an interesting interview with Teddy done by Milt Hinton. In that, Milt asks Teddy what it was like, you know, to become part of, because even though, you know, Teddy only worked in the beginning only in the trio, he was part of he traveled with and was part of the Goodman entourage, so to speak. And Teddy says right away, he said, you know, Milt asks him, he said, was it anything like Jackie Robinson had to go through when he, you know, became the first black baseball player, you know, in the major leagues? And Teddy says right away, no, not at all. He says, never had any problem with any of the guys, you know, any of the musicians, was totally, you know, like family. And that, I think, is, you know, is an important thing, at least it seems to me that it is. That's something that makes this music special, because it was like an oasis. There were lots of problems, don't get me wrong, and there were lots of inequities and so on, but nevertheless, on a very human level, and that, I think, was something that affected the audiences too. It was something that brought people together, and that's the way what the music is like too.
Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering if there's going to be anything new on the horizon. I know there's hip hop and rap, but not everybody can relate to that. And I was wondering if there's going to be any new type of beat on the on the horizon.
I don't see anything resembling a movement or a new way of playing or anything like that. We're a little jealous of the past because there were so many of those. There was, you know, traditional New Orleans style, there was swing, there was bebop, there was hard bop, there was cool jazz, there was avant-garde. All these movements really meant something, and they were different, and they were all part of a tradition, and if you were, you know, you could trace how they went. When I used to teach, I would begin a class that would be about Lester Young, Ben Webster, and Coleman Hawkins, and I would tell the class that at the end of these 2 hours, you'll be able to identify in a blindfold test, and they would all laugh, it's impossible. And then we talk about the three musicians, and then I would play the only recording on which all three of them are present. And usually about 80% would be able to recognize Lester Young, and maybe close to half would know the difference between Hawkins and Webster. It's this individuality that we're going to be dependent on, because I don't think we're going to see new movements. We're going to look for people who can express themselves in such a way that we say, oh, that's so-and-so, he can really play.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it quits. Thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for coming.